now, my next guest, saying that the Henry Review is at best underwhelming, and indeed, if you call it that, you're perhaps even at risk of running it as an overstatement. George Lucas from Instreet with me in studio. George, I suppose, really, these were the recommendations, and it was a very bland document. Then we got a very colourful singing, dancing response, but was it full of sound and fury?
Well, let's just clarify one thing. The review wasn't underwhelming.
No.
It was the reaction by the government to the review.
That's the point, and that's what I'm saying. This was the bland, kind of the dry but necessary blueprint, right?
Yep.
But what we got was a lovely website response, very, very flash, but light on it.
Very light on it, and some of the response wasn't even in the Henry Review, like the increase from in the super from 9 to 12%.
They wanted it lower, didn't they?
And also they took into account that an increase in super will actually affect the salaries of the employees, average wage employees, and that was one of the reasons they didn't recommend it. And by phasing it over 10 years, it's a way of slowly creeping. I mean, you'll see it in the wage negotiations, and employees will just lose 30 basis points per annum as this creeps in.
Is it a case of, though, looking at this, George, for the reality that it is, that a lot of tax reform, when you look at our statutes today and what they were like 30 years ago, they're a world away, are they not? I mean, I've been speaking to tax professionals saying a lot of it's done outside of an election cycle.
Yeah, and the original GST proposal was done in 1975 and wasn't actually implemented until, 2000. And so it does take a long time to come in. Also, the Henry Review was done and began in a completely different world. It began in a world where government deficits were falling, and the need for Australia to become very tax competitive was high, especially when Asia was a lot more tax competitive than Australia. And the world's changed. Tax rates are increasing, and countries are becoming less and less tax competitive, and so the need for Australia to become so tax competitive has also dropped off the top of the level of what governments are concerned about.
I was talking to some who were saying as well, buried in the recommendations were perhaps more flat tax proposals as well to come out, so you'd have, a smaller band at which you're taxed in terms of, the amount would run right through, say, from 25,000 right up to 180,000. Is that feasible? Yeah,
and I mean, that's a very UK type of system. It's also a very UK type of system where your tax returns are filled in for you, and there's, it's a 2-page tax return for most people, and it can be completed in 5 to 10 minutes.
Is it progressive? Is it as a philosophy progressive, though?
What? That is very, a very simplified and progressive way of doing tax, because it simplifies the amount of work that you have to do. And what really, for me, is the biggest disappointment out of all this is not a hint in what the government has implicated that they're going to bring in tax reform and simplification of the tax system. I mean, that would be the big key, the simplification of the tax system.
In fairness, when you say not a hint, when it comes to deductibility, that has been simplified. There's an option, much like the US, where you can simply opt for the generic clawback. You don't have to put everything down in writing. You don't have to have a bundle of receipts anymore.
Fair enough. That's, yeah. But there wasn't more of hints. I was hoping for a lot more than what actually came out. Do
you believe, though, there's only a matter of time that perhaps that will be something that will come perhaps after the next election?
Well, no, I honestly believe that the pressure is now off the government to do much tax reform because of what's happening from the GFC and the fact that tax competitive is not such a major issue as it was 3 or 4 years ago, and so there are a lot of pressure off the government to actually do anything in the tax arena for 3 or 4 years.
What about small business? You're saying that, if anything, the definition set at a $2 million turnover, that perhaps was a bit light on it?
Yeah, I would have liked to see a $5 million turnover, which was in the Henry Review. But anything to help small business, I mean, this is the real plus from the report. Anything to help small business is a benefit. At the end of the day, small businesses are the major employees in Australia.
So how's the super contribution helping small business when they have to pay more?
Well, because I think it's a misnomer that small businesses will actually end up paying more. I think employees will actually end up paying
by
for
what?
That 3%.
By paying for their jobs?
By the fact that it's phased in over 10 years, and so their wages, instead of increasing 3% per annum, for example, will increase 2.7% per annum.
A lot of people, though, saying that small businesses, a lot of them don't even set themselves up as companies, so they can't benefit from that clawback on the lower tax rate that's been announced, the move from 30 to 29%. Is that a fair comment? A lot of them set themselves up as trusts, but will still have to pay the compulsory super increase.
If you set, yeah, I'm not fully up to speed on that, but obviously your trust, you know, if you set yourself up as trust and you're a trading trust, you get taxed at the corporate rate. So I'm assuming that rate will come down to 28% as well.
Other things that were on your radar as well, you're saying reintroduced initiatives that were taken away. What are you getting at there?
Well, there used to be 2 years ago, you know, low-income earners used to get $1,000 contributed to their super if they were on low income. That was taken away, I think, at the last budget, and it's been reintroduced at a $500 level.
That's the thing, George. People say enough with tinkering. Every time it's changed, every time we're told this will be the cap, then it's moved higher, then it's moved lower. Are you sure that this is where we're at now for good?
But that's, you know, that's the other big point. I mean, for example, everything's phased over such a long time period that the governments love to change super every year, and so there's no certainty around any of these changes coming in, especially things which are phased in over 10 years.
So what about the ones that were done immediately? For those that are the immediate changes, what are you impressed with?
Oh, I'm, you know, impressed with the $500, and I'm impressed with the $50,000 coming back in.
So raising the cap from 25, at which you can invest at.
Yeah, it's back to 50. Even though it's limited at the 500,000K level, it's still a great move. But phasing things over 10 years' time is just such a long time period that things can change.
And we know offshore headwinds as well. We ignore those that are peril. When you look, George, at what is developing offshore, are you confident that we're not going to have another V-shaped dip downwards on a global recovery basis?
Actually, I am getting more and more confident every day on this. The figures that came out overnight, the GDP figures in the US, for example, were a bit light on, and that's probably one of the main reasons why the US market got sold off. But the good news in those figures was that sales, consumer and industry were beginning to dominate more of the GDP numbers. And so economic theory is right, and as someone explained to me the other day, we're getting into a spiral. So we've started off with the government stimulus, and it's beginning to feed through to the consumer industry. And if they can now take up the baton, we'll begin to see the global economy really taking hold.
What happens if they drop the baton like in a relay? It's all over, isn't it?
It is all over, but at the moment there's no sign that that's going to happen. I mean, obviously there's still the headwinds there about the high unemployment levels offshore, but at the moment the signs are good that it's not going to happen, and GDP figures tend to be getting revised up.
George, how is it sustainable though when that consumer spending increase that you talk about was not driven by an increase in disposable income but by a decline in the savings rate to 3.1% from 3.9? In other words, people drawing down their savings to spend. That is not sustainable, I put to you.
Well, let's wait and see. I mean, there's a lot more figures to come.
Okay, is that a way of budging, George?
Yeah.
All right, okay. Good. We'll wait and see, as you say. It's a month figure.
Yeah. Right. And so there's a lot of trends. You know, we don't see the trend. It's just a good sign that it's beginning.
George, we do appreciate it. Have a great week.
Thank you.
Thanks. George Lucas there from Instreet, of course.